The voicemail lasted 47 seconds. I know because I listened to it 3 times, and each time I counted. "We've talked it over," my mother-in-law's voice said, smooth and unhurried, like she was leaving a message about a dinner reservation. "You were never really a good fit for this family, sweetheart. We think it's best if you step back. From the business. From the holidays. From all of it. We wish you well." Then a click. I was sitting in the parking garage of Mercy General, still in my scrubs, my stethoscope around my neck, a cold cup of coffee in my hand. I had just finished a 12-hour shift. I had held a man's hand while he died at 6 a.m. because his family hadn't arrived yet. I had called him pediatric code at noon. I had not sat down once between 7 and 3. And my husband's mother had just fired me from her family via voicemail. I sat there for a long time. The concrete echoed around me. Someone's car alarm went off 2 levels up and then went quiet. I looked at my phone screen at her name, Carol, and felt something shift inside my chest. Not breaking. Not the way I would have expected. More like a dial being turned. Like the moment in a procedure when you stop trying to be gentle and just do what needs to be done. I drove home. I didn't call husband. I didn't call my sister. I went home, changed out of my scrubs, and sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. First, let me tell you about the ledger. I started keeping it in my head the year I married into the Whitmore family, because that was the year I realized that love, in their world, was a transaction. I just didn't understand yet that I was the one always paying. My father-in-law, Gene, ran a mid-sized commercial real estate company out of Charlotte. Nothing glamorous. Strip malls, office parks, a few warehouses outside the city. But the family treated it like a dynasty. Every Christmas dinner, every Sunday call, every conversation eventually circled back to Whitmore Properties like it was the sun. Everything else orbited. My husband. I'll call him by what he became to me, not what I once hoped he was. So I'll call him my ex-husband, even though we weren't divorced yet when all this happened. Had been CFO of the company since his father handed him the title 4 years before I entered the picture. He didn't earn it the way he described it to me when we were dating. He'd made it sound like years of grinding, proving himself, working up the ranks. What he hadn't mentioned was that the ranks had only ever had one person in them, and that person shared his last name. I had my own career. 12 years in emergency medicine, the last 5 as a nurse practitioner. I ran the fast-track unit at Mercy General. I had my own income, my own savings, my own professional reputation built on 12-hour shifts and decisions that mattered. I never needed anything from the Whitmores. But they needed things from me. The first ask came 6 months after our wedding. My mother-in-law, Carol, sat me down at her kitchen table, the one with the white marble top that she'd bought to impress the neighbors, and explained in her soft, even voice that the company was going through a liquidity crunch. Just temporary, she said. Gene had made some investments that hadn't performed the way he'd hoped. They needed a short-term infusion to keep payroll running. They needed $35,000. I want to be clear about something. I didn't have to give it. My husband had asked, yes, but he'd asked quietly, almost embarrassed. And when I hesitated, it was Carol who came to me directly. She talked about family. She talked about what it meant to be a Whitmore. She looked at me with those careful eyes and said, "We don't forget the people who show up for us." So I showed up. I wired the money from my savings account. I didn't ask for paperwork. I didn't ask for a repayment timeline. I trusted the marble countertop and the family crest they'd had framed in the foyer, and the idea that people who had a family crest were the kind of people who kept their word. 6 months later, Gene bought a boat. Not with my money, he explained, when I mentioned it at Thanksgiving. It was a different account. An investment that had come through. He waved his hand the way men like him wave their hands. And the conversation moved on to the turkey. And I filed the moment in the back of my mind under things I should think about later. Then there was my sister-in-law, Brooke. She was 24, perpetually between things. Between jobs, between apartments, between phases of a life she couldn't quite get started. She was the kind of person who was always just about to figure it out. I liked her, honestly, in the beginning. She was funny and a little lost, and she reminded me of a few versions of myself I'd already survived. When she decided she wanted to open a wellness studio, yoga, meditation, something with crystals and a salt lamp, I think she needed startup capital. The bank wouldn't give her a loan. Her credit was thin. Her parents didn't want to put business expenses on their personal accounts for tax reasons that I'm not certain were real. I gave her $22,000 over the course of a year. She called them loans. We never signed anything. The studio opened. I attended the launch party. I bought the overpriced candles. I liked her posts. The studio closed 11 months later. The $22,000 became a number I thought about sometimes when I couldn't sleep. But the money, as much as it stings to say, was not the worst part. The worst part was what they did with my name. When I was in my 3rd year of nursing school, I worked 2 jobs: a diner on weekday mornings, a hotel front desk on weekends. My feet cracked in the winters because I couldn't afford the right shoes. I graduated with $67,000 in debt, and no one in the audience for me except my college roommate and my older sister, who drove 4 hours to be there. My parents had been gone since I was 17. I built everything I had with no floor beneath me. When I joined the Whitmore family, I thought I'd finally found the floor. What I found instead was a stage. At their events, I was introduced as a nurse, delivered with a slight softening of the voice that made it sound like a polite way of saying less than. At their business dinners, I sat at the end of the table and smiled at the right times, and was never asked a question that required more than a single sentence. When Jean's golf buddy asked what I did and I started to explain the fast track unit, the triage protocols, the NP credential, Jean interrupted to say, "She takes good care of people," and the conversation moved on. Once, at a 4th of July party, Carol introduced me to her book club friends as her son's wife. That was it. Not by name, not by profession, just a relationship and a possessive apostrophe. I smiled. I always smiled. I had learned early in emergency medicine that you don't let the room feel your frustration. You stay regulated so the patient stays regulated. I had applied that principle to 7 years of Whitmore holidays without fully understanding that I was treating my own marriage like a code situation. The morning after I received Carol's voicemail, my husband called. He didn't lead with an apology. He led with logistics. "Mom said she reached out to you," he said. His voice had that careful, neutral quality that I'd once confused for emotional maturity. I think it's probably for the best, honestly. The family dynamics have been a little complicated. I think some space could be. "Did you know she was going to call me?" I asked. A pause. We talked about it. I hung up. I sat at my kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen, and I wrote down every dollar. The $35,000 for the liquidity crunch, the $22,000 for the wellness studio, the $8,500 I'd covered when Jean's roof had a hailstorm claim that their insurance disputed, the $4,200 birthday trip to Napa that was supposed to be a gift to the whole family, but I'd paid for because everyone else had been a little stretched, the groceries I'd brought to Sunday dinners for 4 years, the co-pays I'd covered for Brooke's therapy because her parents believed in mental health in theory but not in practice. I added it up. $74,400. I looked at the number for a long time, then I opened my laptop. Here's something I'd learned in 7 years of being useful to the Whitmores. They were not careful with paperwork. They were the kind of people who believed that status protected them from consequences. They didn't shred documents. They didn't read the fine print. They assumed that their name, in Charlotte real estate circles, was a kind of armor. What they hadn't considered was that I was a nurse practitioner with a clinical eye for detail, a documented case of having been defrauded, and a cousin who was a contract attorney in Atlanta. I called her that morning. Her name is Felicity, and she's the kind of person who does not waste words. She listened to me without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. "Do you have any written communication? Texts, emails, anything where they acknowledge the transfers?" I didn't text from Carol, thanking me. I had an email chain where Jean had said the $35,000 would be paid back within 18 months. His exact words. In writing. I had Venmo transaction records and wire transfer nations and a screenshot of a text from Brooke that said, "You're literally saving my life, and I will pay you back every penny I promised." "Okay," Felicity said. Here's what we're going to do. But before any of that happened, before the attorneys and the documentation and the part of this story where everything changed, there was one more act I needed to perform. My husband had called me from the family home. I knew from years of Sunday dinners that the Whitmores held their informal family meetings in Gene's study, the room with the mounted bass on the wall and the leather chairs that smelled like his cigars. I knew that Carol scheduled everything in her Google Calendar and shared it with the family. I knew this because she'd added me to the shared calendar 3 years ago when she was coordinating a surprise party for Gene, and she had never removed me. I could still see every event they scheduled. There was a family meeting on Friday at 2 p.m. The subject line said, Transition Planning, Whitmore Properties. I was not invited. But I knew something they didn't. 2 years earlier, when the company had been restructuring after a difficult quarter, my husband had asked me to sign some documents. He'd been rushed, distracted, doing 3 things at once. He'd slid a stack of papers across the kitchen table and said, It's just a formality, a spousal acknowledgement thing for the restructuring. I'd asked if I should read them. He'd said the lawyer had already reviewed everything. I'd signed. I had never gotten copies. I called Felicity back. I described where I remembered. She was quiet for longer this time. Get me the name of their corporate attorney, she said, and don't talk to your husband or Carol or anyone in that family until I call you back. I did nicht all. I went to work. I did my job. I held it together the way I had always held it together, with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that falling apart is a luxury you schedule for later. Felicity called me 4 days later. Sit down, she said. The documents I'd signed were not just a formality. They were a partial spousal guarantee on a line of credit the company had taken out. In the event of default, I was partially liable. They had used my signature and my good credit, which was excellent, built over 12 years of never missing a payment to secure better loan terms. They had used me as collateral and not told me what I was signing. Is that legal? I asked. Barely, Felicity said, and only because you signed voluntarily. But the disclosure requirements were not met. They were required to provide you with independent counsel notice. They didn't. That makes the guarantee voidable. I absorbed this. Outside my apartment window, it was raining. Someone was walking a dog on the sidewalk below, hunched against the weather. What does voidable mean for me? I asked. It means, Felicity said, that you have leverage. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the clean, hot satisfaction I'd imagined when I used to have the quiet fantasy, on bad days, of just walking away from all of it. What I felt was tired, deeply, bone-tired, in a way that had nothing to do with my shift schedule. I had spent 7 years being useful. I had handed them money and labor and silence and my professional credit score and my name signed on documents I hadn't been allowed to understand. I had smiled at people who introduced me without my name. And they had called to tell me by voicemail that I wasn't a good fit. Felicity filed the motion to void the spousal guarantee. She also sent a formal demand letter for the $74,400 in undocumented loans, attaching every text, every email, every wire confirmation. The response from their attorney came within 48 hours. The message through official channels was stiff and aggressive. The transfers were gifts, not loans. I had no documentation of an agreement. I was attempting to extort a grieving family during a difficult business transition. Carol had apparently told her attorney that I had been unstable for years, that I had a difficult relationship with boundaries, that my behavior had contributed to strain in her son's marriage. She tried to make me sound like the problem. She had, without realizing it, put that characterization in writing. Felicity smiled when she read it. I could hear it in her voice over the phone. They just handed us the narrative, she said. She called you unstable in a formal legal document, while we're simultaneously arguing that you were competent enough to sign a spousal guarantee they desperately need. They can't have both, I said. No, Felicity said. They absolutely cannot. What happened at the Whitmore family meeting on Friday, the one I hadn't been invited to, I only know from what Brooke told me, weeks later, over coffee. By then, she had stopped pretending that loyalty to her family was the same thing as loyalty to what was right. She told me that Jean had stood up at the head of the table and explained the situation. The spousal guarantee was at risk. If it was voided, the line of credit terms would change. The company would face a liquidity event. They needed to resolve this quietly and quickly. Mom kept saying you were being vindictive, Brooke told me, turning her cup in her hands. She kept saying she never imagined you'd do something like this. I thought about that. The voicemail. The 47 seconds. The parking garage and the cold coffee. She called first, I said. Brooke nodded. I know. She looked up at me. I didn't call him. Didn't need meanie. Did Dee Barack every penny. That was real, by the way. I meant it. I know you did, I said. I didn't more told my parents I wouldn't testify against you, she said. Whatever that's worth. It was worth something. I told her so. The settlement was reached 6 weeks later, in a conference room downtown with a lot of white walls and not enough natural light. My husband, we had filed by then, so I can just call him my ex, sat on one side of the table with his parents and their attorney. I sat on the other side with Felicity. They had brought Jean, I think, to perform authority. He wore a suit that was slightly too large for how much weight he'd lost, and he looked at the table and not at me. Carol wore a blazer and had her hair done. She looked at me once, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between contempt and the particular exhaustion of people who have run out of someone to blame and can feel it happening. The terms were negotiated. Not everything I asked for. Less than what they owed, in the way that justice often costs you something just to get partial change back. The spousal guarantee was formally voided. A repayment agreement was signed for $55,000, structured over 2 years. It wasn't $74,400, but it was signed. It was real. It had their names at the bottom. When it was done, Jean reached across the table to shake my hand. A reflex, I think. Something his body did before his brain caught up. I looked at his hand for a moment. Then I stood up, thanked Felicity, and walked out of the conference room. I didn't shake it. My ex and I finalized the divorce 4 months later. No children. Clean asset split, because I had insisted on maintaining separate accounts and both our names were on nothing we hadn't specifically agreed to share. I got the apartment. He kept his golf clubs and his title at a company that would spend the next 2 years slowly unwinding. Brooke texted me the day the divorce was final. Just a single line, I'm sorry it went the way it did. You deserved better from all of us. I read it standing in line at the grocery store, buying dinner for one, which had started feeling less like absence and more like quiet. I texted back, thank you. I hope you find your thing. She did, eventually. She got a job with a nonprofit doing community health outreach. Nothing glamorous. Meaningful work. She seems genuinely happier. We get coffee sometimes, in the careful, low-pressure way of people who share a history, but are building separate futures. I kept working at Mercy General. I applied for the clinical supervisor position I'd been putting off because the application process was long and I'd always been too tired at the end of my shifts to add anything to my plate. I got it. The title changed. The hours changed slightly. The work, at its core, stayed the same. You show up, you do the thing, you don't let the room feel your fear. The last thing I let myself grieve was not the marriage, not the money, not even the years of Sundays at that marble kitchen table. The last thing was something smaller. When I was packing the apartment to move into a place that was only mine, I found a photo in the back of a junk drawer. It was from Jean and Carol's anniversary party, the year before everything came apart. I'm in it, standing at the edge of the frame, half turned toward the camera, smiling at something off to the side. Carol is in the center, talking to someone. My ex is laughing at something his father said. No one in the photo is looking at me. I held it for a while. The girl at the edge of the frame, making herself useful, making herself smaller, convinced that if she was good enough and patient enough and useful enough, eventually someone would turn around. I didn't explain myself. Not because I was angry at her, because she had waited long enough and it was time to stop. If you are the person at the edge of someone else's frame right now, I want you to hear this. The people who make you invisible are counting on you to keep showing up. They have no plan for what happens when you stop. That is not a threat. That is just the truth. Build the plan. Then change the locks. You don't owe anyone a warning. There's a photo I found at the bottom of a junk drawer while I was packing. I'm standing at the edge of the frame at a party I helped plan, wearing a dress I bought on sale because the good money had gone somewhere else that month. No one in the photo is looking at me. I held it for a long time before I put it in the recycling bin, not because I was done being sad about it, because I finally understood what I was looking at. For years, I thought the problem was that I hadn't done enough, hadn't given enough, hadn't smiled through enough, hadn't been patient enough. That if I just kept showing up, kept wiring money and signing documents and sitting at the end of the table, eventually they would turn around and actually see me. That's the quiet lie that people like Carol and Jean depend on. They need you to believe the deficit is yours. It isn't. What I know now, standing on the other side of it, is that the way this unraveled was not random. Carol left that voicemail because she believed I would absorb it the way I had absorbed everything else, quietly, without consequences, while still being useful the next time they needed me. She had no framework for what happens when the person they've been counting on decides to actually count. Every dollar I'd given, every document I'd signed without reading, every Sunday I'd spent making myself smaller. Those weren't just personal losses, they were data points. And when Felicity asked me if I had anything in writing, I realized I had been documenting their behavior for 7 years without knowing that's what I was doing. That's the thing about paying attention, about actually thinking clearly in situations designed to make you emotional and reactive. It isn't cold. It isn't ruthless. It's the only honest thing you can do when someone is depending on your confusion to keep the arrangement going. I had to learn to separate what I felt from what was actually true. I felt like maybe I owed them something. What was true was that they owed me $74,400, a voided guarantee, and an apology I was never going to receive. But here's what I keep coming back to, the part I didn't expect. The hardest thing wasn't fighting them. The hardest thing was deciding I was worth fighting for. That took something I'd been slowly building for 12 years without a name for it. The kind of backbone that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need an audience, that just shows up when the situation calls for it. The same thing that got me through nursing school on 2 jobs and a couch. The same thing that held me together through a 12-hour shift the morning after I got that voicemail. Brooke told me once, over coffee, that she thought I was the strongest person she'd ever watched go through something. I told her I didn't feel strong. She said that's usually how it works. I think she's right. The people who build real things, real lives, real integrity, real clarity about what they will and won't accept, they rarely feel powerful in the moment. They just keep making the next right decision. And then the next one. And eventually, the decisions add up into something that can't be taken from them. If you're still waiting for the people who use you to someday see you clearly, stop waiting. Not because they're monsters. Some of them are just people who never had to reckon with the cost of what they were doing. But the reckoning will come, one way or another. Actions accumulate. Patterns hold until they break. The only question is whether you'll be standing on solid ground when that happens, or whether you'll still be holding the frame together for someone else's picture. Change the locks, build the ground. That's the whole lesson.